Any discussion of BSE must start with the proposition that British beef is safe.
Later this year, a senior judge will deliver his final verdict on one of the worst peacetime disasters ever to strike this country, mad cow disease, or bovine spongiform encephalopathy. It's a disease which has cost taxpayers billions of pounds. It's driven many in the agriculture sector completely out of business, and so far, it's claimed the lives of at least 50 people. Scientists now warn that mad cow disease could eventually kill 500,000 people in Britain. The Ministry of Agriculture still records 50 new cases of infected cattle each week.
New variant vCJD is an illness which becomes a fairly steadily progressive disease involving lots of functions of the brain, but in particular loss of memory, loss of thinking ability, what's called a progressive dementia. And eventually the individuals will end up severely disabled, unable to walk or look after themselves, rather unaware of their surroundings because of impaired brain thinking function, a severe dementia, and unfortunately eventually die. And it is now believed on good evidence that this is the result of BSE contamination of food from, of course, BSE in cattle.
Good morning and welcome. I'd like to say a few words and then I'll take questions. I'm Nicholas Phillips. I'm chairing this inquiry. I normally sit as a judge in the Court of Appeal. May I introduce...
Over the past 2 years, Lord Phillips has uncovered a remarkably detailed story of conflict at the very heart of government. It's the sort of story that would normally have remained secret for at least 30 years.
Scientist.
It was a further 7 months before ministers were told of the new disease. They immediately commissioned research to find out what was causing it. But it wasn't until a year after that that the Ministry of Agriculture for the first time made BSE a notifiable disease and asked farmers to stop selling their mad cows.
Welcome back. You rejoin us at Bridgewater Market up in Somerset, where, of course, there's the usual gang of barren cows up for sale. This, quite a nice-looking bunch. Not all dairy cows, though, end their days in such a healthy state.
Well, the NFU is not that worried about the disease because it's never got to epidemic proportions and there's no evidence that it's likely to. We regret very much that the compensation isn't at 100%. It will be interesting to see how farmers do respond and whether they will think that 50% is enough to encourage them to notify. The worry is that if they are discouraged, that they might sell them to their neighbours, or even if they don't do that, sell them to the slaughterhouse down the road, and those statistics are lost, and so we won't know how serious the disease is.
In terms of the public health risk, there really isn't any, because the bits of animals which can harbour the BSE organism, that's to say the brain, the spinal cord and other nervous tissues, are removed from all cattle. and destroyed and have been banned from human consumption because of the remote theoretical risk that BSE could cross species from cattle to humans as it's cross species from sheep to cattle. What we were saying was that the beef you are eating is safe, which was true from the moment that they banned the specified bovine offals from the human food chain in November 1989. If you'd asked me in June 1989 whether I was 100% certain that all meat, all beef products were safe, I could not say yes, because I knew that there would have been brain material from animals in the last stages of incubating BSE going into the food chain, and I said as much at the time and wrote as much at the time. It's on the record. But once that avenue of infection was closed off, we were perfectly correct in saying that there was no threat to public health from beef.
The decision in 1988 to blame the disease on contaminated feed did not satisfy everyone. It was angrily rejected by renderers and feed manufacturers who, with government help, continued to export their suspect product to countries outside the European Union. Some scientists agreed that blaming BSE on contaminated feed was too convenient. Although there were similarities, what if mad cow disease was not the same as scrapie, but instead was something new and far more dangerous?
We are eating, as a country, beef from cattle and from cows which contain the BSE agent. The issue is that we don't know if man is vulnerable to this agent. If we are, the effects are so awful that we cannot take a risk. And if I think that there is a risk of an infection, I'm going to say so, and I'm quite certain there is a crisis of major proportions. That's why we're here. We couldn't have a proper debate. They didn't want to know. All they kept on saying was that the best scientific advice is that there's no possibility of BSE infecting people. So I said that isn't the best possible advice. That's advice you want to hear. And they were just personal and nasty. And I had an awful lot of phone calls, letters, death threats, graffiti, malice, abuse.
I think that when that risk was perceived, that should have been shared with consumers. Why should consumers have not been warned of the risk? Now, on the face of it, had they done so, people might have adjusted their diets, they might have made a decision. They might have made the sort of decision that they ultimately made in March 1996. But is it really seriously put as a proposal that you should not only hope for the best, but you should effectively wait to see if your experiment on the human population is successful?
Scientific evidence does not suggest, does not provide even a shred of a suggestion that BSE is transmissible from cattle to humans. Yeah, I mean, you can accuse John Gummer of going over the top when he fed Cordelia the hamburger and all the rest of it. He felt he was doing right by the beef industry at the time, and he felt he wasn't creating any risk to public health because the measures to protect public health were in place.
By 1990, the British Veterinary Association was so concerned about the human health risk, it warned its members to take particular care when dealing with potentially infected cattle. But no such advice was ever given to abattoir workers. The Ministry of Agriculture was also concerned that its ban on specified offal was not working. And still, the original cause of the disease eluded scientists. These are Aberdeen Angus cattle, top pedigrees from award-winning herds. Some of these cows are worth several £1,000s each. Fed exclusively on grass, it's not possible to find a safer source of beef anywhere in the world. And yet no cow is completely immune from BSE.
We were first hit with BSE on my own farm in early 95. We had a case, and a pedigree Simmental cow was bought from Scotland with her sister as breeding heifers from Scotland. She then went down with BSE. Nobody wanted to believe it. We spoke to our own vets. We monitored for 6 to 8 weeks until she actually collapsed on her knees.
In 1995, Stephen Churchill from Devizes in Wiltshire died after a strange and terrifying illness. He was 19.
In the summer of 1994, we felt that Stephen wasn't the usual happy schoolboy he had been. He became withdrawn and miserable and felt he didn't have any friends.
And then the physical problems started. Difficulty with eating, cutting his food up. Probably the most significant thing was his inability to sign his own name. And then it just continued like that. He became more physically affected, and he started the classic staggering.
And that was when Stephen was transferred to a hospital in London for tests. And even at the end of that, they said it was possibly CJD, but that was a disease of the elderly. And they just didn't know why this lad who had been very fit and well was wanting to join the Royal Air Force, loved the outside life, was dying of this disease.
Only 6 months earlier, this patient walked to the Okapa patrol post without assistance over rough mountain terrain.
By late 1995, scientists were drawing comparisons with the cannibal Kuru tribe and its endemic affliction from a strange variant of CJD. But the possibility that this was similar to BSE was not widely publicised, until the following year, what had once been dismissed as an extremely remote possibility became all too probable. By late 1995, the Department of Health was becoming increasingly concerned about a terrifying new disease, similar to CJD, which had, by then, killed 12 people.
The most likely explanation at present is that these cases are linked to exposure to BSE before the introduction of the specified bovine offal ban in 1989.
We weren't forewarned the announcement was going to be made in the first place, so it came as an absolute shock. And I was actually sat in a television studio over in Bristol, and I just sat there and thought, my God, that's my son.
Soon after the government's admission that BSE could, after all, kill people, there came more bad news. Scientists at Oxford, having finally been granted access to the Ministry of Agriculture's own statistics, discovered that MAF had got its sums wrong. The true incidence of BSE was actually 6 times higher than the ministry had been hoping. Britain had an epidemic affecting nearly 1 million cattle.
Any discussion of BSE must start with the proposition that British beef is safe.
They're still wrong if they're claiming that beef from animals under 30 months of age is safe and over 30 months is dangerous. It's ludicrous to think that a hazard occurs over a few days. We know that the infection can be passed from the mother cow to the calf, therefore it's in blood. We know this happens with many mammals, and therefore, although it can't be detected because the methods aren't good enough, of course the infection will be there.
The BSE inquiry has heard how the former chief medical officer tried to warn ministers that safety procedures at abattoirs were being ignored. But the Ministry of Agriculture stopped him presenting a critical report to a cabinet committee.
Tout d'abord, dans les statistiques britanniques elles-mêmes, que nous connaissons très bien, nous sommes des lecteurs très très attentifs de l'ensemble des informations qui sont issues du Royaume-Uni et qui sont d'ailleurs souvent d'excellente qualité. Pour les animaux qui sont nés, enfin qui ont moins de 30 mois, il y a une petite proportion, mais ça existe, d'animaux qui peuvent être malades avant cette date-là. Et ce qui veut dire qu'il y a une proportion encore plus importante d'animaux qui peuvent être simplement en incubation.
I really don't think that you can fault the precautions which are now in place, which are far more effective and comprehensive than the French precautions. The French have got BSE. French don't have an over 30 month rule. And a Dutch scientist recently calculated that the chances of someone contracting variant CJD from French beef are between 5 and 8 times greater than someone contracting variant CJD from British beef.
Scientifiquement, il est difficile de le dire. C'est-à-dire que la première chose, c'est qu'il se trouve qu'en Grande-Bretagne, vous avez subi, parce que vous étiez les premiers à être confrontés à cette affaire, qui était nouvelle et difficile, vous avez subi une véritable épidémie. C'est-à-dire que vous avez plus de 180 000 cas, ce qui est énorme, ce qui ne s'était pas vu dans le domaine de la santé animale depuis 30 ou 40 ans.
I don't believe this government is in touch with what's going on in the West Country. There's so many of them losing their farms. They've got children at college. They've got to live. They wanted Christmas presents. But where is the money? Stuffed away in the Treasury. We take it all, boys. We've got 2/3 of all your value. And it's due to this bloody committee sitting here and let them get away with it.
Before BSE, suckler cows could fetch up to £1,000 at market, but now, when they reach the age of 30 months, they can no longer be eaten, and their value to the farmer is just £280, less than a third of the pre-BSE premium.
It's the biggest disaster British agriculture has ever had. If you talk about farmers being bankrupted, mercifully there were relatively few, because the very worst of the crisis happened to coincide with a time when the pound was relatively weak and prices were reasonably high. And of course the government did also pump a lot of money in to make sure that farmers didn't go bust, and that was extremely welcome.
They were fortunate in that they got compensation. The families from human BSE haven't had a penny, but I hope that the farming industry will learn something from the Phillips report as well. I think it's tragic that the families who are grieving, like ourselves, were forced into have to campaign for this inquiry. We should never have been put in that position, but we were, and we've done it. And we now have to decide after March what the future will hold.
It's not the farmer's fault, BSE, and I'll stand up with my hand on my heart anywhere. We all thought that we were feeding the animals the correct food. The government and the NFU, to be fair to them, have been asking for years for feed labelling, ingredients of feed, what was in the food. Even today, that is still not law, which is totally wrong.
The death toll from new variant CJD currently stands at 52. Families who cared for the victims want the inquiry to ensure that nothing like BSE can ever happen again.
I think they are very angry about farmers, and there may have been some who, knowing that they had on their farms sick animals, nevertheless may have pushed them off to market in the hope they could get away with things. Anger about the way in which farmers have been compensated when they have not been.
You know, farming has suffered huge losses, and some of those losses should not have happened. And the reason they've happened is that someone was breaking the law.
On pourrait nous accuser de protectionnisme si nous étions comme certains autres pays, c'est-à-dire très exigeants vis-à-vis des Britanniques et en même temps ne faisant rien chez nous. Or, il se trouve que, certainement grâce au comité d'experts français, la France est un des pays, et certainement le pays qui en Europe a pris le plus de mesures cohérentes de protection de la santé publique. Et je vous rappelle que c'est quand même le premier pays d'élevage en Europe, donc c'est celui à qui forcément ça a coûté le plus cher.
I think the rules and regulations we have in place in this country are very good. But after going to France myself, it frightens me to death what's going on in the rest of Europe. They say they're doing the rules and regulations and safety, but they're not. But the more frightening thing is we've cleaned up the act in this country, in the meat industry, the feed industry, but the rest of Europe hasn't. But we are importing that product into this country. But surely this government, for public health, if nothing else, should ban any food coming to this country that doesn't come up to British food health and safety standards.
The Phillips inquiry is expected to be damning in its criticism of the way the Ministry of Agriculture handled the BSE crisis. Some government ministers believe the inquiry report may even give them a reason to abolish MAF, strengthening the independence of the new Food Standards Agency.
And I think it is in that area of risk assessment and risk management that they will be most concerned to know that the balance will be struck in the future in favour of the consumer rather than, as in this case, of the producer.
Producers' and consumers' interests are identical. A farmer has absolutely no interest whatsoever in trying to sell consumers dangerous food.
It is conceivable, if you make certain assumptions, that there will actually be only a relatively small number of cases, but it's also conceivable, if you make different assumptions, that there will be, in fact, an epidemic of variant CJD. And at the moment, I'm afraid, from a strictly scientific point of view, the only thing that can be said is we don't know how many cases there will be.
When Lord Phillips began his inquiry, the death toll from new variant CJD stood at 24. He concluded his investigation with a chilling warning.
Today, that number has doubled. No one can say whether or not those victims are just the tip of an iceberg of infection that is still concealed from sight.
After 15 years of mad cow disease, many hope that Lord Phillips' report will be the final word on this terrible disaster. And yet for those now dying from new variant CJD, it could be that the final report of the BSE inquiry is simply the start of a whole new chapter of compensation claims against the government.
When morning comes again, I have the love that there's you left me.
I think we're dealing with a new disease in cattle and in humans. It's fatal. It's horrendous to watch somebody die of this disease. It's young people dying. The average age is about 27 years old. And we shouldn't take risks. The British population, we were all taking a risk in the 80s. Now they know the problem, they shouldn't take the risk anymore. It's just horrendous, this disease, and I can understand the French, why they don't want to risk their population. Why should they?